After months of anticipation, Alec Murdoch's appeal of his murder convictions heard before South Carolina's Supreme Court, and it was nothing short of a detonation. Speaking of detonations, the Epstein files reverberating all across the country, including exclusive connections to South Carolina uncovered by FITSNews. Last but not least, a big week in South Carolina politics, including Epstein fallout driving one of the leaders in South Carolina's governor's race. All of that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. For the past few months, FITSNews.com has been meticulously preparing for the appeal of Alec Murdoch, the convicted killer who was found guilty in March 2023 of murdering his wife and son, took his case to the state's highest court this week. And again, for the last few months, we've been analyzing how this debate would go. We've been looking at cases, studying prior rulings, looking at legal standards, breaking down the arguments, and discussing in detail the evidentiary, admissibility, and jury tampering issues that form the basis of Murdoch's appeal. None of us were prepared, though, for what actually happened in South Carolina's Supreme Court this week. None of us knew just how prepared, how aggressive this court would be in diving into these issues. No one was ready for the unmasking, if you will, of the state's contention that these verdicts completely above board. That theory has been shattered. And it wasn't a podcast that did it, wasn't a website that did it, wasn't a book that did it. It was 5 justices of the South Carolina Supreme Court who came into their building loaded for bear. I'm joined now by Jen Wood, our research director. Jen, you have spent more time preparing for this hearing, breaking down the laws, the evidence, the rulings, everything that was going to factor into this hearing. No one was more prepared for what was going to happen in that courtroom than you. Yet, I remember seeing you as you came out with your jaw on the floor based on what you saw. Tell me in your words, as you sat in front of those 5 justices, just behind the lawyers making these arguments, tell me what was going through your mind when this spectacle unfolded.
I was stunned. I don't think there is any other way to put it. And I don't know. I mean, this was my first Supreme Court hearing. This is the first time I had attended oral arguments. So I don't know if part of it was that, but the absolute, I mean, the pace of it and the intensity of their questioning and just how probing they were stunned me. And it was, I mean, I felt it in the room. I mean, everybody was on the edge of their seats as the questioning proceeded and just grew more and more intense.
Now, a lot of folks have remarked that this is normal for justices to be aggressive. It's normal for them to pepper attorneys who appear on that hot seat in front of them with questions. I mean, that's the job. But you told me leaving that court, and it was a word that you used that has stuck in my head ever since. You said they were angry.
Yes.
Tell me what you mean by that.
They just, to me, the way that they were phrasing the questions and the way, especially during the part where they were discussing the jury tampering, they seemed just mad. They were mad that this had happened in South Carolina courtroom. I mean, that's the only way I can describe it.
Well, this hearing started with the defense.
Mm-hmm.
This was sort of the reverse of the trial. In this case, it's the defense making the argument, hey, these convictions need to be thrown out. Here's why. And so it was Attorney Dick Harpootlian who went first. And toward the end of his remarks, I thought he laid kind of the moral foundation for this with a commentary on the trial of Aaron Burr, and going back to how anyone, no matter how notorious, has the right under our system of justice to a fair trial. And his argument was, quote, that didn't happen here. But I wanted to cut, our first clip that I want to cut to, Jen, is Attorney Dick Harpootlian talking about that trial of Aaron Burr and the ruling from Supreme Court Justice Marshall. Let's take a listen.
The Sixth Amendment was based on as you know, English common law. In the trial of Aaron Burr in 1807 for treason, this is not for killing Hamilton, this is for trying to sell part of the United States to Mexico. He was a piece of work. Chief Justice Marshall quoted from Lord Coke, who said, "A juror must be as indifferent as he stands unsworn. His verdict must be based upon the evidence developed at the trial. This is true regardless of the heinousness of the crime charged, the apparent guilt of the offender, and the station in life which he occupies." You can't say it any clearer. And that's what the Sixth Amendment guarantees. And that didn't happen in this case.
I mean, Jen, that's at the heart of this, and that's what we've been saying for
Right.
months.
Right. I mean, no matter how, he's been convicted of dozens of financial crimes, like reprehensible crimes where he stole from vulnerable clients, people who trusted him. And no matter how reprehensible you think he still deserves a fair trial. And in my opinion, he did not get one. Whether or not the justices agree, we'll find out. But that is the heart of the case.
Yeah. And I want to give a quick shout out. Eric Bland, an attorney who represents several of Murdoch's victims on the civil side, who pushed for accountability on that. Somebody we've butted heads with in the past. He's a pretty aggressive, sometimes abrasive guy. But I want to give some particular credit to him because in the analysis that he provided in the run up to this hearing, he spoke about that being the fundamental issue and talked about whatever we think of Alec Murdoch. And I don't think anyone hates Alec Murdoch more than Eric Bland. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who does.
I agree.
But he said, look, this is foundational to our system. And then after the hearing, I thought it was impressive. Attorney Bland thought it was going to go one way. It clearly went another way. He actually had the guts to come out and say, look, I was wrong.
Right.
Which you don't hear very often in this line of work. So credit to Attorney Bland, not only for the approach that he went into that hearing with, open mind, focused on that foundational issue, but admitting after the fact, hey guys, I mean, why don't more people do that, Jen? And why didn't the state do that in this case?
I think towards when they were questioning Creighton, I think they kind of pushed him into doing that. There was a part during the questioning where they said, wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
He was like, absolutely. There's just no other way. There was no other way for him to answer that question.
Yeah. There was another moment that I thought was very interesting as Creighton Waters was, again, under siege. And it's the first time I've really seen Creighton Waters, a very experienced, very adept prosecutor, quick on his feet. That's the first time I've ever seen him lose the narrative.
He has, and he also has a lot of appellate experience. Appellate court is a whole different beast. You're under a time crunch. You've got to get your arguments in front of these justices. You've got to be ready for any question they can ask you. It is a very different beast. But he does have experience in this. This isn't his first rodeo. And as it kept going, I'm sure he was sweating.
Yeah. And he did have an unforced remark during the section on the jury tampering. Your Honor, only a few of the justices heard that, referring to one of the remarks made by former clerk of court Becky Hill to the jurors that allegedly swayed them. Only a few jurors heard that. One of our responses on social media, I thought it was pretty interesting. Only a few of the jurors were tampered with, Your Honor, not all of them. And that's kind of how people took
Right.
it when they heard him make that kind of.
And it was the first thing that came to my mind when he said that. I was like, oh,
yeah,
how you ooh, I could almost feel him going, oh, crap.
Yeah. But we said it, and we had our good friend Seton Tucker from the Impact of Influence podcast here in this studio the day of the hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked with Seton about the impossible position that Creighton Waters was put in. His job is to defend those verdicts. And based on Becky Hill's conduct, those verdicts are now really indefensible. So it's kind of an impossible.
Right. He is in a very difficult position. And, he argued very well in front of the justices, but he is in a difficult position because of Becky Hill. It is not his fault.
Well, and let's give a listen. We're going to talk in a moment about the intensity of this questioning, but let's give a quick listen to, this is Chief Justice John Kittredge during his examination of Creighton Waters, or discussion with Creighton Waters. Here's the fury of what Creighton Waters was dealing with. Let's take a listen.
Help us understand the ostensible inconsistency when the trial court finds portions of Juror Z's affidavit credible and just carves out and doesn't deal with the part that dovetails with the alternate juror's testimony, which is far more prejudicial.
Sure.
How do we do that?
Well, so we're looking for, I would submit from an appellate court's standard of review, we're looking for support in the record for those findings. And so when you look at Juror Z, okay, and first of all, you look at the 11, which she did credit, and none of those 11 heard any of these other egregious comments or anything like that. None of
What
them.
do we do about the order that doesn't even mention that Juror Z did in fact testify about the comment, "Don't let the defense confuse you"?
Jen, I think you're right. I think they were mad.
Yeah. I mean, there's no other way to read that room.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, based on what we're seeing and hearing. We've had folks talk to us after this hearing who said this is going to be 5-0. They are going to send this back for a new trial. It's going to be 5-0. But we also heard from lawyers who've argued before the Supreme Court who said, listen, I've walked out of that building thinking I had a unanimous verdict in my back pocket, and I've been unanimously defeated.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, they've walked out thinking I'm toast. There's no way I'm going to win this based on that questioning, and then they've ended up getting a unanimous verdict in their favor. So while it is obvious what happened this week at that appeal hearing, it's not 100% what they're going to do.
It is not. No. And you know, they're looking at case law, and they are applying case law to the arguments and the record on appeal. So all of the transcripts, all of the filings, I mean, it is not a 100% just because we felt the tone of the questioning leaned one way. They could lean another way once they get, and get into rooms, start discussing what they heard.
Yeah, but it was not secret where they were coming from. And
No.
you talked about those rulings and the standards. They weren't just going hard to the paint on Becky Hill's conduct. They were going hard on the prosecution's interpretation of these rulings, basically saying, we don't see this the way you see it.
Right.
So that to me was kind of the
extent of how they are allowed to question the jurors in the aftermath, and if they're allowed to question the jurors, whether or not it affected their verdict. That was a big point of contention for them, and a lot of the questioning pointed to them having a problem with that. And it'll be interesting to see when this ruling comes out, if that is addressed. Because if they're not allowed to question the jurors whether or not it affected their verdict, then the presumption that it did to prove that falls to the state.
Yeah. And I thought the one thing that Chief Justice Kittredge said, he talked about how irrespective of what standard you want to apply, some conduct is just so far over the line that it is what he called a structural error, which is a new
Correct.
trial, something that's warrants a new trial.
Exactly.
That was interesting that he threw that in there as a possible, benchmark for the justices as they decide whether or not to give Alec Murdoch a new trial.
Absolutely.
Jen, you mentioned a moment ago the juror testimony. Something I wasn't prepared for in this hearing was the extent to which the justices were focused on what we've called the egg juror conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
Our media outlet has been one of the only media outlets covering this case to focus on the plight of Myra Crosby, who was unceremoniously thrown off this jury, branded as a violator of the court rules for talking out of school based on some questionable allegations against her, and to be frank, some questionable investigation of those allegations. This is a woman who was maligned in the aftermath of the trial, but basically we've now found out, again, according to her statements, they threw me off because I was the only one who wouldn't say where I was on this case.
Mhm.
Everyone else was telling this rogue clerk of court, we think he's guilty. I was the holdout, and they kicked me off the jury for it.
And let's talk about just everybody else was telling her that. And, I was undecided. And I told Becky that. Why is Becky Hill asking her
There you go.
what, what she's thinking about the verdict, about anything related to the trial?
But-
You ask her what she wants for lunch.
But we've written extensively on this. And by the way, one of the justices said it best. Justice should be blind. Court officials should be mute. I thought that was one of the
I was
quotes.
like, amen.
Absolutely. But when we zoom this back out to the egg juror conspiracy, no one other than us really has been talking about this. And yet it was one of the singular focuses of the justices as they peppered Creighton Waters, saying, why wasn't her testimony?
Why wasn't she allowed
Yeah.
to testify? There was testimony in the evidentiary hearing in front of former Chief Justice Jean Toll from an alternate juror, what she heard, and they wanted to know why Myra Crosby wasn't allowed to testify. They had a lot of questions about that, and they wanted to know whether or not they could consider this. And at one point, I thought this was really interesting. They were when they were talking or questioning Dick Harpootlian, they wanted to know if they could consider her affidavit and, why wasn't it? And Dick's, I don't know. There's no coherent reason given. They kind of steered him into the answer, and they're considering that.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And for those of you out here who are wondering where this story goes, there are a few places that we've been following extensively. Obviously, the larger drug network that Alec Murdoch was plugged into, the expansive judicial corruption that helped enable his thefts in the first place. But we're also digging into that egg juror conspiracy, folks, and there may be some actions coming before long, which are going to dig into it even deeper. Because if you think it was just tampering that Myra Crosby, the egg juror, has pointed to, no, look at her statements. It's much bigger than that. Much bigger than that. But Jen, as we look at the flow of this hearing, clearly the egg juror component was something all of us were like, wait, wow.
Yeah.
They are focused on this in a much more robust way than we ever anticipated. But the other thing that took me by surprise was just how zeroed in on admissibility they were.
Yes. And honestly, that, as much as their focus on the egg juror surprised me, that actually surprised me more. That, the questioning was almost as intense during the discussion of the evidentiary issues, especially the admittance of all of the financial crimes, all of that testimony. And they seem to have some serious concerns.
We've got a clip now from Chief Justice Kittredge where he addressed Creighton Waters about those admissibility concerns. Let's take a listen.
Unlike the federal counterpart of 404B, our case law has said that our version of 404B is a rule of exclusion, not inclusion.
Right.
And the gate here was just left open. And I couldn't find any example of financial crime evidence that was excluded. And the granular detail in the expansiveness of which everything under the sun was allowed is arguably problematic. Even the nature of the victims, there are many examples here, and I want you to respond, so I'll just share one.
Mhm.
I think his name is Tony Satterfield,
Right.
was testifying. Well, we had to hear about the disabled brother.
Mhm.
How is that relate to motive evidence? That appears to be that not only is he a thief with a motive for murder, he's a despicable, low-life character. I mean, the very evil that 404B is designed to prevent, and then ultimately 403 as the final safeguard.
And it really comes down to, if you're going to admit these kinds of crimes, it's not into it's they pulled a very good example with the testimony of Tony Satterfield, who was one of Alec's clients, a victim of his financial crimes, and asked why the questioning was allowed to go into his disabled brother.
Right.
basically indicating that, you can get the information about the crimes in, but they went too far.
Right.
And it was basically a character trial as much as it was a murder trial.
Yeah. And it was interesting as the defense for Alec Murdoch made their case, there was also some discussion of the evidence about the state, particularly establishing its timeline through a witness that was not an expert on the phone toss that established the timeline. This, of course, is the phone that was found, Maggie Murdoch's phone, found on a roadside near the Mizell property where she and her son, youngest son, were murdered. This phone, key to the prosecution's timeline of events, putting Alec Murdoch at the scene and leaving the scene at the moment they claim these shootings took place. Of course, that was challenged too. They talked about the coroner establishing time of death with the armpit
The armpit temperature,
test.
stick his finger in the armpit. Oof.
But it was the phone toss where they had an expert on another matter come in and say, well, I threw a phone around and sometimes the light came on, sometimes it didn't. And then during the trial, as we recall, precise navigational data came in during the trial, which seemed to show that Alec Murdoch was not in a position to have made that happen at the time
Right.
prosecutors said he did, which, of course, implies that maybe there were some other folks there on the crime scene that night. We've had theories about that for a long time, Jen, but during the defense's pushback to that, one of the things that struck me as interesting was they talked about this gathering storm of all these financial crimes that Alec Murdoch had committed. It was all catching up with him, and the only thing he could do to get the attention away from him was to commit this crime. Philip Barber, an attorney for the defense, shredded that with one statement. Did you tell me about this? Set this clip up for us, John.
So, yeah, I mean, he was talking to the justices about, you know, if somebody was trying to distract from financial crimes, murder seems like a bit much.
Yeah, let's take a listen to Attorney Phil Barber making that point before the justices.
We didn't have whatever it was, 12 days of financial crime testimony just to prove the fact that he stole a bunch of money and might possibly have had some fear that he might one day be caught for having stolen that money. And then the speculation is, well, he wanted a distraction, and we can talk about why this would, the logical leap to I'll just murder my family and be the center of attention, and how that's somehow going to get scrutiny off of me, obviously doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think he, more than most people, is in a position to know, given his background, that putting himself at the middle of a high profile murder investigation is not the best way to distract attention from his own affairs.
A lot of mic drop moments in this hearing, Jen
Right.
Wood.
Right. And when we were talking about it with Seaton after the hearing, she said that was a light bulb moment for her. Even as much as we've covered this case, there are still moments where you're like, oh,
Yeah.
oh, good point. And Phil Barber, holy cow, he did some real good lawyering. That's all I'm going to say. And what he did was he presented the rebuttal. So he came after, all of the arguments regarding jury tampering and the evidentiary issues. He was the final person questioned,
Yeah.
and he was rebutting everything in front of the justices, which means he's got to have knowledge of, he's got to be ready for anything that can get thrown at him. And he was more than ready. I was very impressed.
No, absolutely. So, Jen, what happens next?
We wait. It could be a year, could be 3 months, could be 30 days, but we wait for the justices to review everything. And very quietly, 1 week, I think usually Tuesday or Wednesday, that's when the advance sheets from Supreme Court and Court of Appeals come out. It will be included in the advance sheet.
You're going to be checking that like a
I check it every week.
crack-addled
Yeah,
lab rat?
I do. I've got a number of cases I'm following, so yes, I do.
Yeah.
But yeah, it'll probably be a little more aggressive checking. But yeah, it'll quietly come in, and we will know whether or not they've reversed the verdict, they've remanded it back to circuit court, or if they have affirmed the verdict.
Yeah, upheld the convictions. Those are the three options. Jen, you've done amazing work on this. being in that courtroom, having you there, watching it. Just give folks here your kind of experience of that moment, being in that courtroom as this was unfolding. What was going through your mind? It was just a dramatic moment to witness live.
It was far more dramatic, far more intense than I thought it would be. And at points it was almost uncomfortable. Like it was very, very aggressive. And that could be normal. I do have a couple of more oral arguments I plan to attend over the next few months. So it'll be interesting to see, if that is normal. I don't think it is. But yeah, it was absolutely fascinating to witness.
Yeah. It's the most aggressive questioning I've ever seen from those justices.
Yes. Yes.
I want to close, though. We mentioned him earlier, and his comment after this I thought was the best note to end this on. We mentioned him earlier, Eric Bland. I wanted to read this. The reason we have the greatest justice system in the world is because it has to work equally for the worst of us, like Alec Murdoch, and not just for the best of us. That is the reality. It may upset us if there is a new trial, but the Constitution must prevail. Couldn't say it better. For those of you tracking this case, FITSNews.com, your home for all things Murdaugh. You can study up on all the appeal documents, all of the arguments that were made in court this week, and our Jen Wood has pinned the definitive recap of that hearing. Again, all on FITSNews.com. The biggest story in our world this week is the amassing of a mighty military armada against the nation of Iran and the kidnapping of Savannah Guthrie's mother, Nancy Guthrie. But wait a minute. That's you getting your dog wagged. The biggest story in the world right now, folks, is the Epstein files, which has exposed corruption and demonic behavior at the highest levels of American elite society, of global elites. It has been an unmasking. And I'm joined now by our Andy Fancher, who has been digging deep into these files. Andy, you found significant South Carolina connections to these insidious documents. You published 2 stories this week, and you're still digging. Walk us through what you found, where you think this story is going to go as it relates to the Palmetto State.
Well, I hope that this story leads to the guillotine or the gallows. Any number of execution methods I'm okay with and will happily facilitate as it relates to the deluge of files and subsequent names within those files released by the DOJ across a approximately 1 to 2 month time frame. And as we have continued to dig through approximately 3.5 million files, which are almost saturated by design, a haystack for people across the globe to sift through, we are finding significant ties to the Palmetto State. Our investigation, if you will, started almost at a frustrating ground level with a report that we kicked out this week, specifically on Jeffrey Epstein paying for WIR in Spartanburg County, which is a county that any frequent reader of our outlet should be intimately familiar with at this point. A county saturated, just the definition of corruption in South Carolina, not to say that corruption doesn't leave the Spartanburg County lines, but nonetheless, from there, we stumbled into yet another thread where Epstein appears to have been communicating with a former Miss South Carolina USA title holder. And from there, we appear to have stumbled into additional threads where Epstein is communicating with university professionals and professors here in the Palmetto State. When I said that we're just getting started, I was not kidding. We haven't even dragged our fingernail across the surface of the Pandora's box that is the Epstein files as it relates to South Carolina.
You talked about that haystack, and I wanted to ask you a question about that because it feels to me, based on what you've shared and some of the documents that we've found, it feels like that haystack is constantly getting blown and little pieces are getting removed, added back with different redactions. I mean, this 3 point whatever million trove of documents, it's been a moving target, Andy. Documents that were originally released have been removed or redacted differently than they were originally. It has been, and even in the research that we've conducted on these particular stories, you found discrepancies in the files.
And specifically the email exchange between Epstein and a woman identifying herself as a former Miss South Carolina, USA title holder, identifying herself as Anna in the email exchanges. We found where some of her emails to him were pulled from the Epstein files or the DOJ library altogether. Others where they were uploaded again with further redactions, removing that Miss South Carolina, USA, and former Miss United States email footer where she was identifying herself. After publishing that story, we found additional files that weren't even re-uploaded, not germane to that conversation, but they weren't even re-uploaded, just pulled from the DOJ database altogether. And speaking on that 3.5 whatever million, I want to emphasize the haystack here because these documents are duplicated, multiplied again to the point of saturation. For instance, in our conversation that we were able to reconstruct between Epstein and former Miss South Carolina, USA, it was an approximately 16 message email chain. Okay. You'd think that that would all just be in one cohesive PDF. That's not the case. Instead, each individual message and data prior or leading up to that specific message is saved across 16 different data sets. And then for some reason, the DOJ likes to upload things in different formats too. So instead of just one cohesive PDF, we're dealing with at least 16 different data sets times 2 with anywhere from 1 to 7 pages each within those data sets, peppered throughout approximately 3.5 million files.
It's almost like they don't want you to put narratives together. It's almost like they don't want the truth to be easily accessible. It's
No,
almost like they're trying to hide the ball.
the American government will, please.
Well, let's think about that in the context of how all of this came to be, because you've got the President of the United States calling the whole thing a hoax. You've got literally
Why are you still asking?
literally only 4 members of his party pushing to release this information when it was first brought up for debate in the U.S. House of Representatives. 4 of them. We're going to talk about one of them in the next segment. And then once it is released, with the Department of Justice saying this is the final release and we have fulfilled our obligations under the law. Andy, how can they say they've fulfilled their obligation under the law when they're actively deleting files that they've released? And oh, by the way, we're told there's millions of additional files that have never seen the light of day.
Right.
How's that add up?
Well, speaking on the 4 Republicans, and you know me, I don't like to get political, but at this juncture, at this point in time, you're no longer a Democrat or a Republican. You're not a pedophile.
Right.
Okay. That should be where we stand on this. There's the line drawn in the sand there.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those 4 Republicans that I trust y'all will talk about in the next segment, Trump's administration has consistently gone after.
Yeah.
So watching this whole thing play out is specifically on the timed release of those things where they said they fulfilled their obligation. We need not mention that they failed to meet their own deadline set by Congress.
Right.
And now what we have is, as I hope I have emphasized, just this scattered deluge of PDFs and pixelated videos that admittedly there are absolutely heinous and horrific things in there. But I can't help but sit back and think, man, this is what the machine wants us to see. This is what they volunteered to us. And what they have volunteered to us indicates that there is baby farming, that there's child sexual abuse, no doubt, child sex trafficking,
child
sacrifices, cannibalism, murder for hire, kidnapping.
And here's the other thing that's interesting is the interactions between this Miss South Carolina pageant winner and Jeffrey Epstein. These interactions took place after his conviction in Florida. They took place literally while he was supposed to be incarcerated. And of course,
while he was serving that 13 months of an 18-month sentence where he was allowed to leave a jail for approximately 12 hours a day. Yeah, that's when that conversation took place. And if we want to speak a little bit more on that former Miss South Carolina USA conversation a little bit, right. She, in her own emails to Epstein, admitted that she was now married with a 2-year-old daughter whom she name dropped. She spoke that she was 7 months pregnant at the time, wrote that she was 7 months pregnant at the time. And from our research, appears to have sent him 3 unsolicited pictures. And Epstein, of course, responds in very few words throughout this entire conversation. And then she responds with, a 200-word biography on how her life is right now, still in Greenville, South Carolina, is still with the guy that I was with last time I saw you. And I suppose the reason that I emphasize these specific anecdotes is because we reached out to somebody who appears to have been that sender. And within just a couple of hours, we were called by an attorney in New York stating that that person is a victim of Epstein's, one who has not been publicly identified before, unlike the hundreds of victims who just this week appeared before Pam Bondi, only for her to not even look in their general direction. So that was news to my ears that this was potentially a victim, and it adds to the intrigue when we find messages of Epstein asking her, "Well, now that you are taken, what friend do you have for me?" And her responding with laughter to say, "Well, everybody in South Carolina seems married these days." I'm paraphrasing the exact
Right.
correspondence, the exact conversation, as we have been able to piece it together, is available on FITSNews.com. It's a lot.
Yeah. Andy, you've done amazing work on this, man. You've been reconstructing these conversations. As you mentioned, it
With the
wasn't
help of
easy.
Jen Wood. I mean, this is going to take a village just at FITSNews alone. And as we have kicked out 2 Epstein exclusive, granted, not much legs, but it's a tier system. So we
Yeah.
started with Epstein buying eyewear in Spartanburg, and from there we went to Epstein corresponding with a former Miss South Carolina USA title holder. I can assure y'all, it's only going to get much weirder from here, based off of what we're looking at. But as we're doing this on our end, I'm sitting here as the hopeless romantic that I am, expecting our local mainstream media partners to be cooking up something just terrific from these Epstein files, because they've remained concerningly, is that a word? Concerningly? Concerningly quiet following the release of these files. Sure, the Post and Courier kicked out a report where they cited a lawsuit against Epstein, germane to, I think that was Hilton Island. And then Fox Carolina, of course, kicked out a story where, Greenville is mentioned in the Epstein file. Okay, well, to what degree? Let's start digging a little bit. So where is MSM? That seems to be the reoccurring question from my desk. Where was MSM during Chuck Wright? Where is MSM? Non-existent.
Well, I think they're covering the second iteration of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, and I think they're covering, World War III about to start, which, again, all that timing, very curious. I don't want to put the tinfoil hat on, but do we have to give a shout out to our conspiracy theorist friends? They've been right.
Unfortunately,
they've been validated.
and it's
vindicated.
interesting the folks that are peddling this kidnapping of the century. You notice too that some of the loudest reporters on that are mentioned in the Epstein files. Not to don a tinfoil hat here, and making a full circle to what you said in the lead. Vanity Fair, of all people, kicked out a magnificent article on Epstein's White House.
Yeah.
And how no matter which dog Trump wags, Epstein has the bone. And it couldn't be more accurate.
And for the political ramifications and implications of that for the Palmetto State, here I am with our Dylan Nolan to dive into that. So now we teleported Andy Fancher behind the desk and teleported Dylan Nolan back into the studio here with us.
We've traded places.
I want to ask you about the political fallout from Epstein. We have seen it play out here in South Carolina, and one of the candidates for governor of South Carolina is pushing it to the pedal.
I think she might have listened to our show last week where we said that she could use this as a way to differentiate herself from her rivals in the 2026 gubernatorial race. She has been sending out press releases highlighting the fact that campaign surrogates from the Yvette campaign have gone after her for her being mentioned in the Epstein files, something that you haven't seen much reporting of in the United States media because the particular file that she was mentioned in was rapidly removed from the database by the United States DOJ. However, it should be noted that this thing does not, with great credibility, accuse Nancy Mace of having participated in anything inappropriate. And in fact, her role in all of this has really been calling for transparency at a time when that is not a popular thing to do as a Republican in Washington, D.C., as Andy pointed out.
Yeah, you mentioned that file, Nancy Mace. It was a email that was submitted. It implicated Ron DeSantis and some very
Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump. The context of this file, though, is that it seems to be written by somebody who is extremely mentally ill.
right.
And it's tough to discern how to interpret that in a situation like this, because if you were somebody who was a victim of the most horrific crimes imaginable from a time before you were in elementary school, presumably you're going to be mentally broken.
Yeah.
So you can't just write something off because somebody said something that, does not read as logical or something that you or I would write. But at the same time, I don't look at this and say, oh, Nancy Mace was engaged in anything nefarious.
Yeah. And based on how aggressive she has been on releasing this information, it has not been, the Donald Trump bait and switch, hide the ball. Nancy Mace has been consistent on this, and we criticized her a lot. But this is something where we've been giving her credit where credit is due because she has been one of only 4 Republicans from the beginning. And I think you made the best point, Dylan, talking about this. You talked about how Democrats had a chance when they had the power, didn't do it. Republicans then gained power, had a chance to do it, didn't do it. But these were the only 4 that really swam upstream, you put it, against their own party, against their own political interests. And Nancy Mace is one of those 4.
And I do think it's kind of crazy for the surrogates of the Yvette campaign to be dogging her on this. I mean, this is, obviously everybody in this race is trying to kiss Trump's ass as much as possible, but maybe we sit this one out.
Yeah. Well, and the silence has been deafening. And I think that just being silent in this case has been a terrible look for Pam Yvette, Alan Wilson, Ralph Norman, all the other ass kissers that you mentioned.
I mean, Wilson is in a position to potentially do something about this.
Yeah. And there are states that are doing something about it. New Mexico, I think, has done an amazing job of pushing the envelope on opening a panel to investigate what happened at the Zorro Ranch. They want to name names. They want to bring this out in the open. So credit to New Mexico for what they're doing. Credit Nancy Mace for what she's done to bring this out. She was in an interesting position heading into this year, Dylan. She had lost a lot of steam. A lot of folks had looked at her court cases and the constant I'm the victim, the theatrics associated with her candidacy, and it had really started to cost her support. But as this year has started, Nancy Mace was already picking up some momentum even before taking this principled stand and making some political hay off the Epstein files.
It's interesting observing her campaign because you'll see her do things that you really are scratching your head and saying, what is she doing? And then 12 hours later, she'll be doing something and you're saying, wow, this is tactical brilliance. And I think that she has deservedly been taking a victory lap on taking a very bold stance here. And the question last week was, is she going to double down? Because it wasn't clear at that point. The documents had just been released and she hadn't really been hammering it. Well, this week in Congress, she has certainly been hammering it. She has been going into the SCIF, which is the Secured Classified Information Briefing Room that they have, in federal government facilities. You can't bring your cell phone in there. It's like a Faraday caged room so that any electronics don't work in there. They're highly controlled facilities. And she's been talking about how the Department of Justice is keeping track of every document that members of Congress are viewing in there. These are unredacted documents that, as members of Congress, they have the privilege of being able to view. They're taking note of the people who have been redacted out by the Trump administration. And Mace has taken fire for assembling this list of people who the Trump administration has refused to name. George Santos, the former member of Congress who was indicted, served a stint in federal prison, was released by Trump, went on a pretty hilarious tirade against Mace. You want to throw
Yeah,
to
let's
it?
play it. Let's watch this. This is pretty unhinged, but yeah, here we go.
Okay, I'm so done with the theatrics. Nancy Mace and this and that. Oh, I've seen names that are gonna make everybody's head spin. Bitch, name names. Name names. Oh, I don't want to get sued. Bullshit. Go on the House floor, pull out a special order, schedule it. The whole country will watch. And guess what? You're protected by the debate and speech clause. Go name names or shut up, you self-aggrandizing whore.
I mean, the whore comment, that's a bit uncalled for, but his point is, okay, you've got this list of names. I mean, clearly she was happy to go use her congressional privilege to say what she wants from the floor of Congress to name the people who she says abused her personally, something that's involved her in a lot of litigation. Well, his point is kind of, isn't it strange that she's not doing the same thing with the Epstein victims that she says she has, or sorry, the Epstein abusers that she says she has a list of? She's responded and saying, look, this requires due diligence. And I think that she's certainly right about that. You can't just be going and throwing allegations this severe around without doing your due diligence. Of course, the proof will be in the pudding over the next couple of weeks, whether she actually comes out and starts naming these names. She has started dripping some out. And she said she's not going to pull punches if these people are Republicans, if they're Democrats, if they're named in these files in a way that indicates that they've committed criminal activity. She's committed to naming them publicly.
And she has several potential avenues for doing that. Obviously, she could make a floor speech, as was recommended, but she's also a member of the House Oversight Panel, which would be the lead committee investigating these allegations. And she has said publicly she wants to have this list called before that panel to testify. So that's another way that this could get out in the open. Dylan, do you think we'll get there, though? I mean, we operate in this world, and we've been talking about throughout this show, where these forces behind the scenes controlling things, pushing levers, dispatching carrier groups to certain parts of the world after meetings with our president. These forces behind the scenes, are they going to let that happen?
I wonder about that as I look at the Epstein situation, because these people, I mean, I would think that this is what they call a limited hangout, which is where you let enough information to satiate the public get into the sphere, but not enough to actually, facilitate change.
Imagine that.
So maybe I think they might let the congressional hearings happen because we all get a nice show on television, but it's not presenting it in front of a grand jury where somebody goes to prison.
Yeah.
And that's what we really need. Now, I'm not saying that Nancy Mace is responsible for making that happen. She is in the legislature. She's not in the executive. She can't put somebody in front of a grand jury. So I would expect her to do as much as she can to bring enough evidence into the public light through her position in the legislature to put the executive in a position where if they don't act, they look like fools, but they're already in that position and they're not acting. So I don't know how much she can really do.
Well, Dylan, you talked often in this race about how Republican primary voters in South Carolina, they don't want to see, people just saying I'm the victim all the time. They want to see fighters. Nancy Mace had been sort of falling into the former camp, but in the last few weeks, particularly,
She's fighting for the victims.
correct. And she's gone from that sort of I'm the perpetual victim to being a nut cutter. And as you mentioned, the other candidates kind of kissing a little Trump ass. And in this instance, I don't think right, the whole ass. So, and I want to point this out, folks, we're going to be the go-to outlet for the 2028 presidential campaign, first in the South for Republicans, first in the country, more than likely for Democrats. If you want to come in this studio, you better have an answer for where you stood on the Epstein files, because as we mentioned on the show before, you're either going to be on the right side of history or the wrong side of history. And Nancy Mace, to her credit, so far on the right side, Dylan Nolan.
I'd love to get her in the studio.
Let's try. We're going to try. We've had some of her competitors in. Let's get her in. This was a big week in South Carolina politics, though, Dylan. This wasn't the only story we've been following. Give us some details on some of the other stories we've been breaking, tracking.
Well, you were kind of teasing them this week, my friend. One of our top traffic stories this week was your story teasing the future resignation of a South Carolina senator. You put a senator in the picture of that image that I think some people in the Senate might want to resign.
He did not, though.
It was actually a different senator.
It was a different, and this was a weird situation because we were informed that this bill had been pushed through the Senate governing special elections. And it was a bill that would hold that if a senator resigned prior to March 1, that their special election would fall on the same date as all the other special elections coming up this June. it sparked a guessing game. People immediately, well, what is this for? Who is resigning? And so all of the speculation initially centered around Matt Lieber, who has been at the heart of just a dramatic domestic drama. His wife publicly accusing him of having an affair with a lobbyist / consultant. We're not sure exactly what her role is or who it's with. Trial lawyers, a lot of people suggest. At any rate, that scandal blew up, and it has cost him significant support. But also, folks looked at Harvey Peeler, a guy who's been in the Senate since 1981. One of the most influential leaders there, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, but a lot of folks saying his health in the last few months has deteriorated. Folks speculated maybe he was going to step down. There was also speculation surrounding Jeff Zell, another senator who's had some scandals in the past, and of course Josh Kimbrell, who has been implicated in a civil court of stealing $2 million from one of his former business partners, and we're told that the feds are criminally investigating that case as well. So no shortage of options, but the end result was someone we had no idea. Wes Clymer.
And somebody arguably we really wouldn't want to see resign. I mean, I think he's one of the Senate's most intelligent deal makers. He's a guy that is frequently sponsoring or co-sponsoring meaningful legislation, but he's running for the United States Congress. He's looking to take Ralph Norman's seat, as Ralph Norman is running for governor of South Carolina. He's based out of the Charlotte area. He's got a great reputation, so I think the South Carolina Senate will be sad to see him go. But yeah, that it does make sense that he's going to try to get out of his seat in such a way that he does not trigger a special election.
Yeah, or at least a special election that falls on different dates than these other ones. And his argument was that, look, I'm tired of people resigning their seat and sticking taxpayers with a $250,000 bill for an election when I can just time it in such a way that they don't have to do that. So that's his argument. I'm saving taxpayer money. But we had Justin Bamberg in this studio for our Fitz Politics show this past week, Dylan. He made a very interesting point. He said, wait. This isn't about saving money, y'all. This is about Republicans don't want to have a special election because in those races, turnout is low. Democrats can get a lot closer to knocking Republicans off. In fact, down in the Low Country, House District 98, we saw Democrats come within 24 votes of claiming a GOP seat in a special election that wasn't timed with all these other
And this is
races.
not unique to South Carolina. We've been seeing nationwide Democrats have been taking unexpected victories in special elections. I mean, we've talked about plenty of reasons why folks might not be jazzed to go vote for the GOP right now. So I do think that there is validity to the idea that this is not done to save the taxpayers $250,000, but was done to help the GOP win an election.
Bamberg always bringing the heat, man, and we loved having him on the show this week. And I just love how this Fitz politic is growing and becoming such a must-watch for people. In fact, we notice it on social media. People are clipping our show and taking some of the good exchanges from it and putting it all out on
It's
their
really
social.
cool to see when you do something like this and you see a clip that's not, we have no hand in generating the clip and it's out there circulating. And that means that we're doing something that's actually meaningfully contributing to the conversation in the state.
That's what this is all about. Speaking of that conversation, some looming issues facing South Carolina lawmakers, some hearings that we're going to be tracking this coming week. One of the big ones involves a case that we have devoted extensive ink to, the Federico case. Logan Federico murdered in downtown Columbia, South Carolina, near the University of South Carolina back in May of last year. Her murder, allegedly committed by a career criminal with a rap sheet mile long, near 40 arrests, 25 of them felony arrests, multiple convictions, someone who never should have been on the streets, who should have been locked up years ago for a very long time. Nonetheless, allowed on the streets by our badly broken judicial system, kills this girl, but her father has turned her death into a crusade. And I'm telling you, Dylan, we've seen a lot of victim advocates. We've seen a lot of family members of victims. We have never seen a force like Steve Federico. He has exploded on this debate. And it is Federico's push that has led members of the South Carolina House to introduce a resolution that would impeach the solicitor that is going to be responsible for this case. Now, while Federico is the motivation and what is the driving force, that's not necessarily what the impeachment resolution is going to be focused on, correct?
This is tied to another instance that it perfectly exemplifies South Carolina's broken criminal judicial system that occurred long before Logan Federico's tragic death. And this is the Gerard Price case. This is the case where one of the most powerful loyal legislators in Columbia meets in a smoke-filled back room with the solicitor. You know, these guys are ostensibly on the other side, and without a very public or transparent process, releases early a convicted murderer.
Yeah, without notification to the family, which, by the way, is unconstitutional. I mean, it was not only illegal what they did with the judge. By the way, it was a retiring judge, Casey Manning, who was in that room with the solicitor and with the lawyer, legislator Todd Rutherford. It's unconstitutional. You got to notify the victims. They didn't do that, and so the Supreme Court, to its credit, said nope, not doing it. They found Price. He was up in New York.
And it should be noted, yeah, this is not a guy who returned to life in the straight and narrow, a guy who was rehabilitated through his time in the South Carolina Department of Corrections. He was a guy who should have spent his whole bid in the South Carolina Department of Corrections, because as soon as he was out, he became a fugitive from justice.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that everything gets injected with race. But I want to point out real quick, the judge who sentenced that career criminal to life in prison, Reggie Lloyd, African-American judge, and the victim in that case, black football player from the University of North Carolina. So
it's a black on black crime that was adjudicated by a black judge.
Yeah.
And then the criminal was let back on the street by a bunch of black attorneys.
Yeah.
So this is not a black on white issue.
Yeah, exactly. And the family that saw its rights unconstitutionally violated, they are the victims here.
Yes. In society, all of us.
Yeah, in addition to public safety, right? Because I want to point out that Gerard Price, this runs in the family apparently. His son already was involved in a shooting at the Columbiana Mall, was sentenced to an extensive prison term in connection with that. And these are, again...
And let's hope he serves all of it.
Yeah, exactly. Let's hope. That's why we expose these things, folks, is so that you don't have judges letting these violent criminals back out.
Because, you know, Mr. Federico has every right to be displeased about the way that Solicitor Gibson allegedly has not thoroughly enough communicated with him about his case. The reality is that victims in these cases, once the crime happens, it is the state's case. And while the victim has statutory protections under the South Carolina Constitution's Victims' Bill of Rights, they are not entitled to constant communication from the solicitors. And the solicitors are slammed with massive caseloads, and there are honest reasons why there might not be communication between a victim and the solicitor for an extended period of time. It may be that they are working on other cases which are going to trial in the near future, and they aren't even touching this case. And it's not because they don't care about it. It's because they are working on what is right in front of them right now. However, what happened with Price is clearly unethical. That is clearly grounds for impeachment. That is something that we as a state have to set a standard that you cannot be doing these kinds of things. And that was the real question that I had at the time was, okay, the Supreme Court stepped in to stop the immediate wrong, which is this guy who should be serving the rest of his life in prison running around on the streets. But my question was, what happens to the judge, the attorney, and the prosecutor who allowed all this to happen? They all are, still have their law licenses. They're still operating. And, this is a start to accountability on that case. So we will be covering that. That's going to be happening on Tuesday.
That's right. It was an unethical release, as Dylan said, an illegal release, and an unconstitutional release of a career criminal back into our society by a shady, secret deal between a prosecutor, a lawyer, legislator, and a judge. And I want to remind folks, it was FITSNews.com that exposed that deal. It was FITSNews.com that immediately called for a full investigation into the circumstances regarding that release. And so I want folks to remember that if it weren't for this media outlet, none of that would have seen the light of day. This would have just happened, and it would continue to happen with impunity. That is why we do what we do here. That is why we call these corrupt institutions out, and that is why we insist on accountability for the folks that are responsible for these decisions. Dylan, what else are we tracking at the State House? It's been a huge year, busy year over there. What else are we looking at?
The Love Gov, your former boss, has indicated that he might be interested in running for the United States Senate.
Well, in fairness, we say he's mulling, but did he commission this poll? There's a big poll, Mark Sanford versus Lindsey Graham, testing some negative messages against Lindsey Graham. Not hard to do, Dylan. There's a ton of negatives you can throw at Lindsey Graham. But is Mark Sanford the ideal candidate to run against him? I mean, I can't think of a
I'm
Worse.
experiencing deja vu from the beginning of this race when Andre Bauer was stepping in. It's like, do we have more than 5 viable candidates in South Carolina? Do we really have to run? And like, I don't have any beef with Mark Sanford or with Andre Bauer, but at the same time, you look at how folks reacted to both of these potential candidacies online, and it's like,
Yeah, puke
really? Are we
emojis,
doing this again?
vomit emojis.
Are we doing it again?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned credible candidates, and I got to say, this is one thing where I think we can speak with some authority because we've had both of them in this studio. Both Mark Lynch, the upstate businessman, and a hell of a guitar player, by the way. He was cutting some killer riffs in here. Cashmere by Led Zeppelin, man. That
Yeah,
guy
that
was
was fun.
that was awesome. But also Paul Dance, who's an incredibly credible attorney, architect of Project 2025. Paul Dance will actually be in this studio this coming week. He and his beautiful wife, Mary Helen Bowers, next guests on FITSpolitics.
Yeah, that's going to be airing live at 7 on Wednesday. It's interesting because Paul Danz's campaign has seen a shakeup in staff, and if you've been paying attention, there's been a shakeup in the tone of how they're conducting this campaign. They've become much more aggressive on their message, and that is good because the numbers don't lie. Paul needed to do this. Paul needed to up the ante to step on the gas, and it appears that he's doing that. So I'm going to be very interested to hear what he has to say about where he's going to take this campaign to pose as legitimate of a threat to Lindsey Graham as he can.
Indeed, because the clock is ticking. Folks, partisan primary elections in South Carolina scheduled for the 9th of June. We are now 4 months away. So if you're going to make a move, now's the time to make that move. Dylan's absolutely right. Clearly a ton of stuff that we've covered this past week, a ton that we have on the docket for the coming week. But once again, if you want that breaking news, that accountability for the corruption, the inside take on exactly what's happening behind the scenes, the puppet masters pulling the strings of the puppets you watch on mainstream media. Folks, only one place to go here in South Carolina, FITSNews.com. Dylan, excellent work this week, man.
Proud to work here, bud.
All right, everybody, that's a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, particularly those of you who are subscribers to FITSNews.com. If you're not already, those subscriptions are what support all the work that we do here, folks. All that accountability we just talked about, it's the result of your support. And by the way, if you're listening on a podcast or another audio format, please consider giving us a rating and, of course, 5 stars. I mean, come on. But anyway, we will catch you next time. Thanks to everybody for joining us on the Week in Review.